Distinguished panelists, dear guests in the room, and even more important, all our friends and guests in this virtual space. So welcome to this panel this afternoon after lunch now here at this incredible, challenging COP, not only for being here and being challenged by so many different actors and content, but also by, I think, the biggest amount of non-state and private actors that we ever have seen on a COP. I counted today that it's my 12th COP in the last 20 years, and it's by far the most impressive one, not regarding only the content, but by the variety of players who are out here. It's really something, even for a COP veteran, to see this going on. I welcome you both on behalf of the Egyptian Federation of Egyptian Industry, who is hosting this room here, and of course on behalf of the Deloitte Center for Sustainable Progress. The Deloitte Center for Sustainable Progress, a new entity that we just founded in, I might say, the Deloitte family, where we really would like to make an impact via thought leadership and eminence in this space, focusing the work that is done by many colleagues around the world in the Deloitte surrounding on sustainability and climate. And I'm here with my dear friend and close ally, Pradeep Philip, and many other colleagues who are here. I have a great panel, and even more to start with, a great subject to discuss. It's about Turning Point. Turning Point, the signature study of our work in the last 24 months, many times discussed and quoted. And today we want to focus on catalyzing action around the climate imperative. This is something that was discussed during this day, at least at 3 or 4 panels I was attending. But here I have a distinguished panel, and we will have different perspective on this in a moment. Let me introduce first my panel, and then maybe Pradeep ask you to say a few words to introduce our point, and particularly the study that we came out today on the skill set, which is so important for the whole transformation. I have just in the order of not in the order of seating, but in the center, I have our colleague and friend Maya Hennekers, the Director, Head of Global Climate Policy and Delivery Financial Institutions at EBRD, brings in a lot of expertise on sustainable finance. As you know, EBRD being on the interface of real industry and financial industry. I have also Wendy Miles here. Wendy, welcome. The Barrister 20 Essex founder, Net Zero Alliance, Lawyers Alliance, law firms making a major impact, often underestimated. I rarely know a project in my competence as a global leader for sustainable and climate strategy at Deloitte where we don't cooperate with law firms, or we don't need lawyers to help us with executing. Then I have my dear friend Volker Ratzmann. Volker Ratzmann being the Senior Vice President at DPDHL, the biggest logistic company in the world. Volker, very much from his background, also an in and outsider into politics in the field of sustainability and climate, now really leading the impressive efforts at DPDHL with regard to their climate and sustainability agenda. Next to Maya, then we have William McDonnell, the CEO of Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. We all are big fans of the carbon market, of course. William, you explain us later what works and why the rest is not working somewhere in some regions in the world. And of course, I have Pradeep Philip, our chief economist in Australia, leading a large team of economists worldwide at Deloitte, and also the signature leader at the Deloitte Center of Sustainable Progress, who will in a moment introduce this wonderful subject of today's panel, and then we jump into discussion. Pradeep, without further ado, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that.
This is not working. Can you pump it up?
Thank you very much.
You have
to press somewhere. There a button?
Pradeep.
Thank you very much for that, Bernard. Let me take you back just a little bit. We are all, I'm sure, familiar with the debate about climate very, very quickly turning to the question about the cost of doing something about climate change. And despite the fact that the science has been clear for a very long time, every time we've had a policy discussion, it turns to, but it's too expensive to do anything about this. The reason we've had such a difficult and protracted debate has been because underlying the debate is an assumption that the world will continue to grow as it has been for the last little while. That is, there has been no account taken of the damages from climate change translating into the economy. So we took it upon ourselves to say, this is not the right baseline against which you can have a discussion about action on climate change. So our Turning Point series challenged this assumption, and we built a baseline for the economy, which, if there was unmitigated climate change, instead of the economy growing at trend, it would start to decline. And it's against that baseline that you could have a discussion about what you should do about it. Now, we know that there are things like damages to the capital stock, sea level rises, the loss of arable land, labour productivity affected by heat stress, and indeed health effects as a result of global warming. If you take these things into account and translate them into economics, you realize that the economy just won't keep growing as it always has been. It'll start to decline. The cost of unmitigated climate change globally, in 50 years, we estimate at about 178 trillion US dollars. And what if you avoided the damages? What if you got the temperature rises to be well below 2 degrees? Well, you avoid damages and you build an economy with a different structure that is low emissions production. And it turns out, if you do this, that instead of a loss of 178 trillion over 50 years, you have a gain to global economic growth of $43 trillion. So that is the prize, the dividend of taking action on climate change. Now, two things drive this. One is technological change, and the second is skills. Too often, when we think about transition, skills or workers become the afterthought. They become the consequence of transition. In our latest report, which we released today, we turn that on its head. In fact, skills should be the driver of the economic dividend, not the consequence of transition. In our work, we identify that there are 800 million workers who are highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change and transition. And what that tells us is that there is a clear policy case for action. And if you take that action, we can create 300 million jobs over the next 50 years. Now, this is the dividend, this is the why, this is the purpose, the economic purpose. So one, that there is growth if you take action on climate change, and two, that in fact those who stand to lose the most have the most to gain. Now that is really important in a COP context, because we've always thought that those who lose always lose. Actually, those who lose can actually be the biggest winners. And that's why the debate at COP is really, really important. Bernard, I might stop there and open up the discussion.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. Great opening, because it opens the space for discussion by both players who know the public sphere very well, but also the private sphere. Maya, let's talk first from an EBRD perspective. I mean, obviously, if I took to boardrooms, I see, I would say, a growing number of C-levels that understand this narrative, that buy it, and they make the sound decisions based on those cases that we explain already when we come in. Volker is nodding. You next, Volker, but maybe with your example. But first, EBRD. I mean, you look both in financial industry and on real industry worldwide. Can you share this perspective and maybe share a little bit what you hear here?
Yeah, I did. No, okay. I pressed it the wrong way around. Thank you. That happens sometimes. Yeah, so I guess for us, as you said, we work very closely with the financial sector, with the real economy, and for both, I mean, sustainable investment has been really enshrined for us in our founding papers, so this is nothing new. We haven't just started to look at it. We've been trying to do this for many, many years. And maybe I would like to point out two ways by which we're doing this. So the first one is we have a dedicated commitment to be a majority green bank by 2025. That means that 50% at the minimum of all of our financing, whether it's to private sector companies or to financial institutions, needs to be green and is and will be green. And but we also thought this is not quite enough. We need to make sure that all the rest of the financing does not go against what we're trying to achieve with the Paris Agreement. So we've committed to aligning all our financing with the Paris Agreement as of the end of this year. So 100% of our financing will be Paris aligned as of the end of this year, and then the 50% will be dedicated green finance. And I can tell you a little bit about how we do that, but also how we bring our corporate and our financial institution clients in to really walk that path with us. And maybe before I go there, I think it's important to remember why this is so important. In the run-up to this COP, well, to all COPs, but again this year, of course, you see there's always the big reports coming out that tell us a little bit where we stand on our climate commitments. One of them that you've surely seen was the UNEP emissions gap report. And I think when you read this, it becomes very clear that, of course, the NDCs and the national commitments are absolutely key, but altogether, they're not sufficient. So we need also the corporate sectors to really put their own pledges in the game and make their own commitments. And this is why we think that the private sector is so important. So the way we do this is that we, together with all the other multilateral development banks, we have agreed on some general principles how we approach Paris alignment. It will cover everything: our financing, our own operations, the way we deal with our treasury operations, etc. So it's really a 360 approach. And for financial institutions in particular, I think what we're going to do is, firstly, they have to commit. So all clients that will work with us, when they want to sign any operation with us, they will have to commit to the goals of the Paris Agreement. This is what we call the pillar one of our approach. The second one is we will obviously make sure that our specific use of proceeds is not in any way counterproductive to the goals of the Paris Agreement. But we thought this is not enough, we really need more, so we're moving on to a counterparty approach by which we work, and this applies both to corporates and to financial institutions, in fact. We work with them to really, assess where they are. So where do they stand on their climate journey? We've based this on the TCFD recommendations because we think we don't need to come up with yet another approach. There's so many different sustainable finance frameworks out there. We need to merge them rather than come up with new ones. So we've based this on the principles of the TCFD. We will assess clients, we will assess the financial institutions, and then we will provide capacity building, we will provide advisory services, and to really help them come up with a dedicated transition plan. And I really think that the transition plan is going to be the core piece of our work, and not only ours, I think of many of us who are in this sphere at this moment, because it needs to become concrete now, right? So we've seen the pledges, we've seen the commitments. Now we need to really have robust and appropriate plans that say, okay, but how are we going to get there? And what are we going to do precisely to get there? So this is going to be the transition plan for us. We've created a big facility which currently holds 25 million, which sounds quite a lot. It's actually not that much when you look at the amount of clients we have. So we're trying to scale this up. Deloitte is one of our partners in this endeavor, but there's many more that we work with to then go and help clients really, okay, what do we need to understand? Because as you may also know, EBRD works in a very diverse region. So the regulatory environment is not conducive in all countries, or is not sending signals yet for climate risk, consideration. So depending on where they are, we really need to provide capacity building. We need to provide very dedicated advisory services. And then, of course, as EBRD, we'll provide the financing, but that will be part of the package. So yeah, this is broadly how we're thinking about doing this. And I think it's super urgent. We're running out of time. I think it was very interesting that you, Freddie, we opened with it's too expensive to do something. I mean, I think it's too expensive not to do anything. That's certainly what we see. I mean, the anecdotal evidence that we have from our operations, how damaging climate risks are already, is absolutely clear. And I think the empirical evidence, we also have enough of it. So, yeah.
Thank you.
We can't wait any longer.
Great starting point of this conversation with your overall view. I'm challenged not to pass it to the more concrete side of your right-hand side to Volker, but going back, William, a little bit into the question of which role climate standards play. I mean, we have many clients, of course, in the financial sphere who ask us how to, implement really climate standards into their work. Maya just referred to the way that they do it at EBRD. I wished all the financial institutions would do it in this sophisticated way, as we know that you do it. But what's your experience with this in your role as an integrity council? Where do you see, which role do they play, and how can we even more leverage them? It's good to have a mic that works, yeah.
Okay, can you hear
Go
me?
closer to it, yeah.
Okay, right, just a minute. How is that? Yeah, very good. Well, look, thank you. And I was, Maya, when you were referring to the fact that there are many institutions out there, I will come to that. But I mean, we agree, like everybody else here. I mean, we know the window for being able to act on 1.5 degrees is closing fast, and that is terrifying for the world. So the urgency is very clear and desperate. By the way, I should just say I'm very honoured to be here. I'm actually a former Deloitte person myself. The first 7 years of my career were at Deloitte, and also wonderful to see Siobhan from Deloitte here, who played a role in our first year of our work as well. So that's a great pleasure. So the voluntary carbon market has a vital complementary role to play here. And the point here, first of all, of course, governments need to reach agreements with each other. They need to set policies. They need to regulate. Companies must decarbonize their operations and decarbonize rapidly, and set themselves ambitious milestones on a science-based pathway. And that's then where, complementing that, then is the role of the voluntary carbon market. And we see three pillars to a high integrity voluntary carbon market. The first is the supply of high quality credits, high integrity. The second is a marketplace that is it's liquid, it's transparent, has the features of a mature market. And the third is the use of credits in a responsible way by the companies buying them, as I mentioned, as part of their science-based pathway. Our work in the Integrity Council is focused on the first two of those pillars. And then there are other organizations who are working on that third pillar. So clearly, SBTI on the science-based pathways internally, VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative. They're working on the claims code of practice for companies for how to use credits that they're buying, what claims to make. And then, of course, disclosure around all of this is incredibly important. And the ISSB, previously the TCFD initiative, there's initiatives really to bring strong, clear, consistent disclosure rules around all of this as well. So I think part of the answer is to have an interlocking set of standards that cover those pieces. And I'll just tell you a little bit more about what we're doing in the Integrity Council. So our goal is to unlock investment so that a high integrity voluntary carbon market can exponentially increase the positive impacts of climate action. And I mean, one of the points here, I mean, Paddy, you mentioned costs, as was mentioned, but actually, if there's a highly liquid market, then that should then give useful price signals that many economists have been calling for, but also to help to direct capital to the most cost efficient, the most effective climate action. And one of the features of the voluntary carbon market is that it is very international. So the compliance markets tend to be regional, but the voluntary carbon market is truly global. 90% of the demand is from corporations in the global north, in developed countries, but the majority of supply and the majority of capacity and potential supply is actually from the developing world. So the voluntary carbon market can also help to be a key channel for flowing finance from global north to global south, which we know is actually one of the topics in discussion more broadly at this COP. But what we're doing in the Integrity Council is we've developed core carbon principles and then an assessment framework of detailed criteria that we can apply to help buyers. So we will be able to label those credits being issued by those crediting programs that meet a threshold quality standard to enable buyers to buy with confidence. And actually there's a skills point here, which is, in my former job, I was in a major insurance group and I was responsible for ESG, among other things. And I looked at buying credits, but it is a fragmented market. There have been doubts about some credits. It's difficult to know what to buy. And when I asked my peers, how do you buy credits? Those who were buying in bulk, they'd recruited their own expert group of 20 or 30 experts to analyze credits and do their own due diligence. Now, we know that's not how mature financial markets operate, for example. And the idea here is that if we establish a common, consistent threshold quality standard, that will then make it easier for buyers to buy credits with confidence. I should say, by the way, we are, as an organization, we're independent, we're philanthropically funded, we've got no financial interest in the outcome, and we have a really superb, very international board and expert panel working on these things, and strict conflicts of interest policies and all of that sort of thing. So we've come up with these core carbon principles and assessment framework. We ran a big consultation recently, and we did a lot of outreach. We were delighted by the level of engagement we had. So we've had well over 5,000 comments from 350 submissions, and many of those from coalitions or groups of organizations across a huge spectrum of stakeholders, from market participants and buyers and financial institutions and MDBs, indigenous peoples organizations, and so on. So we're delighted by that, although now we've got the hard work of working through all of the feedback that we received. But, and I've nearly finished. What we will then do, we want to encourage a race to the top. But this is about balancing ambition and pragmatism. But we want to, first of all, level up, help all of the market participants and the certification programs to level up to existing best practices in the market, and then to engage with the market in terms of what the high ambition pathway is beyond that. Let me wrap up there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would love now to go into one case study that I know a little bit. DPDHL, the largest logistic company in the world. Volker, you are a leader in this industry. I mean, your boss made very strong commitments. You're responsible for a strategy that I would say is also leading in the industry. How do you see the boardroom discussion in your place? If you look both into what shareholders expect from you, into what you hear about the standards, what is important for them to make those decisions that bring them ahead of the curve, that bring them into a leadership role, making more than the regulator wants you to do? And how was this discussion going to make those sound and very tough decisions? It's on.
Thank you. So thank you very much for the invitation. And well, I think what Pradeep pointed out is just in the meantime, I think common in the multinational, at least, companies and in the industry. I think everybody knows what we have to do. And I think we also see worldwide that we have the money, we have the knowledge, and at least technologies being developed, not at hand at scale, but developed to solve all these problems. And well, our company just committed already in 2017 to have a net zero target in 2050. And I think working as a company very much on the ground, we see on hand that we have, or this was coming up even in this comp, to adopt all these new technologies and processes to just change the world. And I think this is the target and the challenge for the private sector, because everybody stated we don't have time. Yes, this is true, we don't have time. And to go faster means that the economy and the productive sector and those who are processing services all over the world have to be faster and adopt these new technologies and processes inside. I think core is what Marnie said. You need to have a very tangible transition plan, a strategy. This is core. And we set up a strategy, as I pointed out, in 2017 to be net zero in 2050, and now released a roadmap with very, very tangible projects till 2030. We pledged to spend and invest 7 billion euros until this time. So this is very, very tangible to adopt all these technologies we need to just transform our technologies. And the boardroom, and especially the shareholders worldwide, and this is my feeling, they really want this development because they see that you can even gain economically and really opportunities to be a front runner in this field. Everybody knows that the world will change in that way, and the more you be a front runner, the more you have the opportunity to set and influence the standards which you need for the transformation and business. And I think standard setting is really key in this for this transition. Being a front runner also means that you have a competitive advantage from compared to all your competitors. The earlier you adopt the processes, you set the standards, and you just shape the environment. But on the other hand, we are sure we are in a kind of, there are lots of challenges. And I think one of the most important challenges is that we are somehow in a supply crunch at the moment. So we have all our targets. We see, and even this is discussed at the COP here, that we have to come from ambition to adoption. So we need a lot of technology, new technologies, and we need them at scale, and not only as part. And this is really the supply crunch. So even us, as we pledge to spend 7 billion euros, we have to consider it. We take into consideration that all the technologies we need, it's not available at the moment worldwide at the market. So what we try is to send the signals to the market from our demand side to push up and to foster the scaling up of the market, especially so the core sector for our reduction targets is the aviation sector. So more than 60% of our emissions coming out of the aviation sector. So what we need is really sustainable aviation fuels. This is what we are looking for. So we are looking for renewable energies worldwide. We are looking for hydrogen worldwide to produce these stuff. We see a lot of very, very ambitious projects coming up, but what they need is the guidelines, and I think the regulation, that all the investors go into this sector are secure that their investments really will change the world and save the investments that they give to this sector. So this is what I say, as a multinational company working in 220 territories and countries in the world, we can really do a difference if we send our demand signals to the market, if we invest in these new technologies, if we buy even pilot projects, like we bought electric aircrafts, the first ones developed by an Israeli company, to just show that those technologies are really been produced and that you can use this, as well as we bought our own electric cars down 12 years before. So I think this is the target and what big companies can do. And well, I think this is what we have to do if we really want to speed up transformation.
Very, very strong point. And I think this is something that I hear in the last 24 hours, often in the halls here in the lobby of the negotiation space at COP, that it's about leading. It's about really leadership in industries. We need leaders in industry that can leverage their knowledge into the other competitors and really make a case for being ahead of the curve. I would love to come back to the EBRD and the financing in a moment, because I see that a good friend of mine is sitting in the first row who is now confronted with the question, how do we really organize massive investments in the global south? And the German government even made him a special envoy for the biggest hydrogen project in the world that happens to be in the southern hemisphere, and really to get the right investments that are still risky to go into this is something that many people are discussing at the moment. But coming after Volker now, Wendy, if I look, and I made this joke about law firms earlier, that they're everywhere on the table, that I am on the table, if I talk to boardrooms and projects, what do you think, what the role, I mean, am I right that I kind of really emphasize the role that both law firms, consultancies, of course, and financial institutions play here? How would you describe the impact that you have there?
Well, the impact I have, or the impact the law has. Bernard, thank you so
Both,
much.
of course.
And thank you so much to Deloitte, and congratulations on this Sustainability Center. It's a brilliant project, and I wish we saw them in law firms. So Bernard said, rarely do we find a project where you don't need a law firm implementing. And the reason we created the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance as an accelerator on the Race to Zero platform was so that we could mobilize commercial law lawyers, and commercial law firms to become enablers in the transition, and in particular to capacity build in those organizations covering hundreds of thousands of lawyers globally, to make sure they don't become obstacles in the transition or look for and put up obstacles in the transition. So if we just run through the entire panel with Maya on finance, for the private financial institutions, GFANZ now has 550 members, and they have just announced that they've been focused on financed emissions. This is their Scope X, Scope 4, the money they manage. But they said they've been focused on that and not on the impact of financial institutions' work in the real economy. And I think that's a really important acknowledgement. There's been a little bit of controversy with GFANZ coming out of the Race to Zero. The 17 member alliances that make up GFANZ are still in Race to Zero. So we don't need to panic about that. But I think it's a really important shift of focus from not just counting the emissions in the finance sector, but looking at what is required down the line in those deal flows to build up, to scale up the alternative infrastructure. So if we come to standards, the important thing about standards in law is that standards are not laws, right? They're standards. And for the most part, certainly with the Race to Zero, they're voluntary standards, with GFANZ as well. Now, companies that enter into voluntary standards may make themselves vulnerable to claims by consumers for greenwashing claims, or potentially for a fraud on the market claim for a public listed company. So there is some vulnerability in not complying with standards, but for the most part, they're voluntary. In order to make those standards legal, for example, the ISSB standards, once promulgated, if they were to become a uniform, harmonized standard, which we'd all like to see, we would need to see them integrated into national company law statutes in a similar way to the international accounting standards are integrated into those statutes. So if that's what we want enforceable by law, we have to put it in the law. And I think we forget that sometimes. Technology, the Paris Agreement, creates an international commitment, international law commitment for states to share climate-related technology. That's an important starting point, but we need, just as a pragmatic, practical matter, to get that technology flowing into less developed countries, into emerging markets, into where we need to build up that infrastructure. In order to do that, we need contracts, we need law, we need legal infrastructure around those investment frameworks. And the same for carbon credits. I missed carbon credits, sorry, William. For carbon credits, William took you through basically the life cycle of a carbon credit, from core carbon principles at the top end, the core carbon principle council or group that sets those principles. They then accredit the standard setters. The standard setters then accredit the project accreditors. The project accreditors then approve individual projects. Once those projects are approved, then the units are created, then they go on market, then they can be bought and sold secondaries 5, 6, 7, 20 times on the commodities market. Every single one of those transactions is a contract. Every single one of those transactions could give rise to a dispute and needs some form of dispute resolution. A well-working carbon market, voluntary carbon market system will integrate end-to-end the dispute resolution system across every single one of those contracts and put experienced people who understand that this is not an exponential scaling up of carbon. This is a way to get rid of carbon, and will understand the role, the important but limited role of offsets in carbon markets. All of these things, so every single thing that the speakers are talking about, needs a legal framework to carry it through in its implementation and its enforcement. But the one thing we haven't talked about that's critically important is the deals. We spend so much time at these COPs talking about finance, and the way I think of it is finance, we like to talk about finance because it's all aggregated in a single dam. We can cover the 173 trillion or however many trillion it is, controlled by a handful of financial institutions in one big dam. We think if we can control how the capital in that dam is used, is deployed, then we've solved climate. The trouble is we can't, because those who look after the dam don't dig the channels for the capital flow. Those channels are dug at a real economy level. This is the public-private partnerships between the power producers, between the road infrastructure companies, between the public utility companies, and the EPC, the engineering, procurement and construction contractors who build those projects. And that's where we really have to look at whether or not our international law frameworks, our private international law frameworks, our investment protections that look after that money when it's invested in emerging markets and higher risk markets, that's where we have to really look at whether that framework is working. And that's the trade and investment framework, which I think we spend far too little time focusing on.
That's a fascinating point, because I know that at least the government, I know a little bit because I have the privilege to advise them sometimes, the German government thinks about exactly those intelligent mechanisms to kind of hedge the risk of investors in this space, which is also a hedging, right? Because you have to decide whether you go into something that is already there and how you do find mechanism to do this. You know that the new progressive government in Germany is really trying some new smart, I think, policy models in this space, and I would love to hear what EBRD and others standard setters think about this. But maybe we do a second round, Pradeep, and focus a little bit, maybe later, on the consequences for workers and workforce, because that's so important. If we, again, my most examples come from the European space, we see that one of the major challenges for the transition to get everybody on board is that we're losing many people on the way because they are afraid of the change. They're afraid of the transformation. What that means for them, right? We are on a very high level here, but if we look at the constituencies of the governing parties in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Poland at the moment, this is a major challenge. We're losing people on the ground, convincing them that we're doing the right things and that there will be a space for them and there will be work for them. And this is why we did invest so much into this global study. And maybe you give us a little bit meat on some of the interesting outcomes of this today, which are directly related to all the questions of standards and private sector investments. Does it work now?
I think
No. Let me take this.
Thank you, Bernard. You know, the themes for this COP is together for implementation. And there are two kind of levels to it. One is the big macro framework, which is in some ways easy, and we do know, but implementation in the end has to be local. And so this is where workers, where skills, where technology needs to transform businesses and communities. We know that workers are highly exposed when they work in climate exposed areas, climate exposed regions. And we know that in high emissions intensive production systems, they're also vulnerable. Now, if we drive economic growth by tackling climate change, we see three categories of jobs and skills emerging. One, where jobs get created because demand in the economy continues to grow because we've avoided the damages of climate change. The second, where there are jobs that will be transformed slightly. And we've heard some of those already today. I mean, we've heard the occupation of lawyers will be transformed because they will start to take into account the idea of sustainability and will start to change their processes and their skill set. And then there'll be a third category of jobs that are completely new, that we haven't really thought about, that will incorporate these skills. And so the world goes on this journey. Just as we created blue-collar jobs after the Industrial Revolution, morphing into white-collar jobs, we now have a third category of jobs that joins that list, green-collar jobs. And this is important because we find that as the world transitions, if you invest in skills at the local level, then workers don't get left behind. They stand the chance of making the transition. And our analysis tells us one more thing. This is not a scary proposition because the skills that we will need in a low emissions economy, we have 80% of those skills already. So if you are a company, don't lose those workers who've been loyal to you. Invest in the transition because they have most of the skills that are necessary. Now, there will be some jobs that will get lost forever. And we have to then spend a lot of effort and good effort in trying to ensure that those people don't get left behind. But for the majority of workers in the economy, Bernard, this is doable. And that's why we need to accelerate this effort. And I'll end on one last thing. If we invest in skills now and help drive the transition, this is the single biggest thing you can do to ensuring that the benefits of economic growth are distributed more equally. This is what it means to have a just transition. If you can give people jobs because you've invested in their skills, it is a single biggest thing to drive a just transition, and that's why this is important.
I really would like to learn, Maya, if this is one of the points that you look at if you do decide about investments or loans that you give to companies.
Yeah, I think, it's important to note that we do look, of course, at climate change in the wider ESG context. So we look at environmental matters, but the interlinkages to social matters, governance matters, they're so clear that I think this is the first thing. So definitely we look for every financing at climate, but within the broader ESG context so that we can also capture the social dimensions of it. Second, and as you've just mentioned, we're doing a lot of work on just transition. We work in some of the regions that are still very dependent on the generation of energy from coal, let's say some sub-regions in the Western Balkans, for example. So we're looking very carefully how we can really provide opportunities there and can take that into consideration when we finance. And the way we do this is we often go through local banks. So we will on-lend, or we will lend to a local bank. They can on-lend in much smaller loan amounts, of course, to people that we can't otherwise reach in more remote regions, in smaller scales. We also, for example, now we try to wire in the green aspect whenever we lend. For example, we have a lot of programs lending to women business owners, and we used to look at it a little bit in a sort of isolated way, but not anymore. We really make sure, okay, this may be a women in business program, but where's the green angle as well, so we can bring the two together. We're looking at green microfinance, because of course when we think about the big financial transformation, we tend to think of those very large finance streams that we've mentioned before. We tend to think about the large-scale project finance type of deals that we do in renewable energy generation, etc. But as we've seen, with time running up, etc., we need to look at all our instruments. We need to look at everything. So we've just started with one pilot with a green microfinance line in Morocco, and this is something that we would like to expand. So I think we need to kind of attack the whole ecosystem to do this in a meaningful way, from all the, the large scale, well, starting from the regulatory really, then to the large scale financing, and then down to those smaller end borrowers that we need to reach and take into consideration.
William, jump on it, please.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add a couple of thoughts that from this morning. So as some of you probably did as well, I attended the launch event for the Africa Carbon Markets Initiative with the climate champions. And I mean, very exciting proposals for how to grow the voluntary carbon market in Africa and run by Africans. But two things really struck me. One was the ambition for the jobs. So 30 million jobs by 2030, 150 million green collar jobs financed through the voluntary carbon market by 2050. And the second point was when the president of Kenya was talking about this as a 9-figure sum per annum export industry for his country. That was his goal. I think that's very much resonates with what's being said here.
Pradeep, jump on.
See, that just reinforces the point that we've lived under this assumption that those who stand to lose. Actually, those who are affected by climate change can make this transition and actually gain. And this is why the distribution question and a just transition is really important, because the North just has much to gain, right? Because the South gains, right? This is this interdependency in the question of climate, which we haven't really tackled and understood well enough.
I would like to leave the role of my moderator, but also making a statement here, because from what I hear in many of the conversations that I have in boardrooms throughout industry, is that this was completely underestimated. And in capitalistic systems like Germany, where of course unions have a say, both on the supervisory level and often also on the executive level, now it comes on the table. If we look at Volkswagen, Volker, an example that we both know very well because it's so popular in Germany, we see that they are really struggling to understand the speed of change and the challenges coming ahead. And now the leadership of the unions, I think, understood that there is no way out, and they have to be either with the train and be in the front of it and drive it and understand the direction and lead this, or they will be out of it. And I think that's something that it's worth looking into, this kind of transformation that the countries that are ahead of the curve, and Germany certainly is one, are going through, because we will see this all over. And do you have experience with unions in your firm?
Yeah, for sure we have. I think we are very well unionized, especially in Germany. So it's the German perspective. But I think you're totally right. The trade union and even the workforces, they at the moment see that they have to engage in this transformation, because there is not only a technical transformation, there is also a social dimension in this, and we will. That's for sure. We will see that there is a lot of distortion in the social equilibrium and in the balancing of wealth within a community. To work on this and to take this into consideration, and even to create trust and faith in the leadership in that transformation, I think is very much important. But I think there is another dimension from a company perspective or from a corporation perspective. the more your employees are engaged in believing in this journey of transformation, and the more they see the necessity and they are willing to do it because they want to adopt a better world for their children as well, yeah, the more successful is the company in this transition. I think this is really a story in our company, because we have employees who believe that this is the only way we can just survive, and we can create an environment in where we can prosper and be in an economy which creates wealth, not only for the employees but for the whole community. And I think you're totally right. We underestimated a little bit, and I think we see this in Germany especially, and in the northern world. The moment there is a lack of workforce, so we need the education. You are right. We need all the people who can install heat pumps and new infrastructure and solar panels and this. And if you want to be successful, you have to educate at the moment. It's not only technology that has to be ramped up, it's education that has to be ramped up in this field. And on the other hand, yeah, as I said, in the northern part, I think we really need workforces. We really suffering from this at the moment very much.
Are we working? Okay, good. So I just wanted to add to that. And what I really love about this Deloitte report on the green collar, other than the green collar workers, which I just think is genius. And if you've read the report, it's got these beautiful little lime green collars on the shirts of the people in the photos. I want one, please, pretty. But what's brilliant about the focus on human resources is it starts to recognize wealth in a different way. And it starts to recognize wealth in a way that's far more reflective of our global economy and not just our global north. So if you look at, this is the African COP after all, if you look across the 54 African states, they are all different. But UNCTAD, the UN Trade and Development Commission, put out its 2022 Least Developed Countries report just this year, and they focused on wealth accounting, taking into account human resources, as well as natural resources, as well as capital. And I think, again, we focus just a little bit too much on the capital, which is the global north's issue, because the global north controls most of the capital. But actually, what we need for implementing transition is natural resources. And as Pradeep has rightly pointed out, and as the report summarizes, human resources globally. And if you just take Africa, for example, 70% of the GDP across Africa, and it's artificial to blend 54 countries as if they're one, so apologies for that, but that's how UNCTAD does it. 70% of the GDP, 70% of the workforce in the GDP is in agriculture. So 70% of the human resource in Africa is working in agriculture. Now, if you think about how much the extractive industries, the natural resources, contributes to the financial element of Africa's wealth, the differential in the use of spread of human resources across those sectors, I think is fascinating. But if we start to value human resources differently, at least equivalently to how we value the dollar, and we start to value natural resources as something that's finite, we're going to run out of the critical minerals and metals that we need for this transition if we don't learn to recycle and reuse them. We're not going to run out of money. We just print more. There's infinite money. There's finite natural resources. So I think we need to start rethinking how we value all of these things and how we do our wealth accounting in this transition.
Yeah, and maybe to add something, that's certainly something that we underestimated. I mean, I've been at, for example, in Paris, nobody was speaking about this at COP21, and I think that's something that on the agenda now. And it's the same thing with natural resources. I completely agree. It's both. So we started this discussion with looking into the costs of not doing the right thing with a new baseline scenario that Pradeep pointed out. I mean, that was really a breakthrough in the discussion. in February, March. I mean, he was quoted with this everywhere, from Wall Street Journal to Financial Times. And now we are at this new study where we really discuss the basic impact that this will have on workforce and how big the workforce role will be in the future. I would argue not only economically, but also politically. Because if we lose the majority of people in the transformation, we will lose the political support for the transformation. And that's what we see probably today in very important election, and also in many elections that we are facing in Europe that will be very, very hard in the weeks and months to come. Maybe a last quick round, and I would like you to open, Pradeep. If you look in the future of this after COP27 process, if you would say two priorities, what would you like both the international negotiation diplomatic process look at and the private sector, which is represented so much here on this panel? What are the two priorities? And then I ask each of you for the two priorities.
First thing, Bernard, is no company can do this on their own. One of the fundamental features of action on climate change is that it suffers from the problem of the commons. No one person can solve for it, but it requires everyone. And this has to seep into our corporate understanding as well. And the second is that while there is speed and scale required of the greatest transformation since the Industrial Revolution, we cannot take our eye off the fact that people are at the center of it. To go to your point, if we leave people behind, we will not only not realize the benefits of the transformation, right, but we will create a world of greater inequality, and that is unacceptable.
I like it very much. Very, very, very strong point. The first time somebody mentions the inequality issue on this panel, that's really a record. Let's take it from the other way as we started. So Wendy first, then Volker, William, and Maya. Your two priorities after COP27 that you want to see both on the diplomatic political space and the private sector?
So I think it goes to both the political space and the private sector, at least from the commercial law perspective, which is my focus. The priorities are, I would like us to start to shift focus from developed countries as net exporters of capital resource in the climate transition, shift our focus to developing countries as net exporters of natural resources in the climate transition, and learn to value those commensurate with the value of capital versus the value of resources, and reflect that both at a policy level, but also at an implementation level with business people, with policymakers in developing countries, from very much from a global south perspective.
Volker.
Well, I see on the first hand the necessity that the global institutions are really now going to create a level playing field by setting standards and regulation to avoid carbon leakage and to avoid competitive disadvantage. Because otherwise you would always punish the front runners who pay much more for new technology and adopting new technologies than all the others. And for me, it's key, especially in those areas like aviation and global logistics, because otherwise you would always create carbon leakage in this sector. And secondly, I think that the most important thing is now to really put pressure and ramp up the technology side, that we really can adopt those things and scale up those technologies we desperately need to just being faster in the transition process.
William.